At fide.email, we believe in protecting your privacy and supporting your faith. Fide.email offers peace of mind with features like end-to-end encryption and secure communications tools. Your data stays private and your values remain intact. Choose an email provider that understands what matters to you. Make the switch to fide.email today. I hope in about 12 months, if I'm doing a year-in review story for you, I remember what I'm about to tell you, because this is a clear contender already for one of the worst or most bizarre stories of the year. And we're, as I'm recording this for you, barely a week into the year, 2025. So I do not enjoy what I'm about to tell you. I laugh nervously because this is a story that will show how ridiculous the position is that many Catholics have, which is, yes, things are bad in the church, but super-based Africa will save the Catholic Church. The priests of Africa are wonderfully orthodox, defend the faith, look at how they handle fiducia supplicans and all the rest. I began to burst that bubble for people when I reported on the very same bishops who objected to fiducia supplicans challenging Rome to give them a way to handle the demand of the laity in Africa to get around the church's teaching on marriage, which is that it's two people in a marriage. Because in Africa, culturally, they want more involved than that. One man and however many ladies he can convince to be involved in the sacrament with him. That's a thing there. People were mortified when they saw that the very same bishops who objected to fiducia supplicans were wanting to change the church's teaching on that issue. Remember that story, because we have a story here of a bishop discovering that a good number of his priests were leading double lives, that they had ladies on the side. They were violating their vows of celibacy and chastity. They weren't living according to the way priests in the Latin Rite are expected to live. In fact, they weren't living the way a Catholic is expected to live, because they were not in a sacramental marriage with them at all, meaning they were committing adultery. Priests, and not like one or two. You'll get that story, kind of happens in America once in a while. Some priests will unfortunately make the secular news as well as the Catholic news for this. No, this was a widespread problem in his diocese, to the point where the bishop put out a public notice demanding that the laity tell him about this when they find out about this among priests. That's how widespread of a problem it was. And when he did that, this started to snowball into some horrible kind of story where Rome handled it as badly as you would expect modernist apostate Rome to handle this. So let's get some context for this story. Go back almost exactly a year to an article published on January 8th, 2024 in Crux, an online magazine which professes to be taking the Catholic pulse, although they usually promote modernism. But they give us this headline: Ivory Coast bishop urges laity to report priest with wives and children. When you're requiring the laity to report the misconduct of your priest, this is where things get really, really bad, because we're not talking here about the McCarrick problems that happen in the U.S. and Ireland and almost any other place in the Western world through the infiltration of the church, men morally unfit to be priests placed in seminaries on purpose by the admission of the now defunct adversary on the other side of the Iron Curtain. They admitted to doing that on purpose through their agents in America. Now, we're not talking about that. We're talking about a widespread problem of another kind entirely. And this gets down to the very simple question: is there a quarter in the church at all where you won't find this problem? This is not a problem that will be solved by rejecting the church's teaching on celibacy. Priests are expected to be celibate and have been since the beginning. There were exceptions to that rule, pretty widespread ones, but those who accepted that exception could not become bishops. They were stopped in their advancement. Full stop. And that was finally lifted and changed, and not so that bishops could get married, but because that allowing priests at all to be married was lifted and done away with more than like 1,000 years ago, which means it's now part of the big T, capital T tradition. It can't simply be hand waved away. This gets to a different problem entirely, and this gets down to purity. Numerous Marian apparitions warn of a rot of impurity in the church, and you are going to see that in this story. This is such a widespread problem, the bishop had to rely on the laity. Again, this is just context before we get to what happened, the horrible way Rome handled this. From the article, quote, in a remarkably blunt plea, a bishop in African nation of Ivory Coast has urged laity to denounce priests who have a wife and children or who are guilty of either misdeeds of the flesh of a mechanic kind or financial crimes, saying that silence about such matters risks the sin of complicity. Bishop Gaspard de Bebe-Gneba of Man in Ivory Coast presented the invitation to report priestly misconduct in a January 4th letter to the faithful of the diocese titled Urgent, Important, and Necessary, which he also had read aloud on the local Catholic radio station. Quote, any lay faithful who knows that a priest is not faithful to his celibacy, has a wife or child, has engaged in mechanic kinds of offenses or economic crimes, must have the courage to denounce him to the bishop. Otherwise, he commits a sin of complicity before God, the Pope, and the Church. Bebe-Gneba wrote in the letter. The Pope speaks of zero tolerance towards these priests, he added, providing information in the letter relating to the directives of Pope Francis and the Church on, quote, the fight against the mechanic problem, economic crimes amongst the clergy of man, and the treatment of priests who have wives or children. Bebe-Gneba essentially called on all priests with wives or children to leave the clerical state in order to devote themselves full-time to the welfare of their partners and children. They must come to see me as soon as possible to present their resignation, he stated. He deplored priests who give the impression that the priestly celibate life has been suppressed or that continence is optional, end quote. As you can imagine, the priests of the diocese were furious. Not at their brother priests who broke their vows and became adulterers. No, they were upset at the bishop. Africa, folks. Super based Africa that will save the Catholic Church. This is where the story takes an even weirder turn. See, Phil Lawler, writing over at the Catholic Thing, gives us this all too predictable update just a few days ago with this headline, a failed attempt to enforce priestly celibacy. Francis intervened after the attempts by this bishop over the next several months failed. The priests of his diocese rebelled against him. We've seen this happening actually in a lot of different places over different issues. What comes to mind is the issues in the church in India, where Catholic priests with a Syro-Malabar rite are locked in a rather heated dispute over the liturgy. The documents of Vatican II say that all the Eastern rites, including the Syro-Malabar rite, should actually retain their traditional form and not become essentially Eastern versions of the Novus Ordo. I know that might surprise some of you, but that had been having a problem even before Vatican II, where they were starting to take on things from the Latin rite of Mass, the Western Masses. And so you have a Syro-Malabar rite that looks like a Novus Ordo there, and you have a Syro-Malabar rite that looks like the Syro-Malabar rite. And you would have priests battling quite literally at the altar, like trying to push each other off the altar during Masses. I mean, it went bizarre, and Francis had to intervene there, and he intervened on the side of tradition, actually, which in this case was the side of Vatican II. But this reminds me of this story. There is a sort of a diabolical spirit right now corrupting the minds of many of the priests who are being just overtly rejecting the church's teaching on all manner of sins. But Francis responded the way you might expect here. He punished the bishop, not the priests. From the article, quote, the clergy of the Man Diocese, however, strongly objected to the bishop's public statement, and particularly to his invitation for lay people to denounce their pastors. The angry priests did not argue with their bishop's defense of celibacy, but insisted that he as going about it the wrong way. His leadership style was abrupt and authoritarian, they charged. He was not a collegial leader. He lacked an understanding of the synodal church. There were complaints, too, that the bishop was a poor administrator. Perhaps he was. But haven't we heard those complaints often in recent years, in cases involving bishops who take a strong stand on moral principle? Is it pure coincidence that the bishops cited for the incompetence in management seem to come exclusively from one end of the theological spectrum? And by the way, if we question why Bishop Gneba waited 15 years to act against corrupt clerics, shouldn't we also question why the unhappy priest took 15 years to notice his administrative deficiencies and his authoritarian governing style? The ruckus in the Diocese of Man came to the attention of the Vatican, and an apostolic visitation was arranged. Of course, that investigation was conducted quietly, and the findings of the inquiry were not made public, but we do know the final results. Pope Francis, who, remember, got this ball rolling with his zero tolerance demand, has appointed an apostolic administrator to replace Bishop Gneba in his administrative role. The bishop will retain his title as head of the man diocese. Archbishop Mauricio Rude Belts, the apostolic nuncio in the Ivory Coast, assures us, but he will, quote, refrain from making administrative decisions during an indefinite period of time devoted to his own spiritual renewal. The appointment of an apostolic administrator, Archbishop Belts explains, is, quote, to restore peace and unity to the Church in Man, ensuring its proper functioning. The Vatican's action shows a commitment to a reconciliation and spiritual restoration, which we can only applaud. But one question remains unanswered. What will the Diocese of Man do about the priests who are living with concubines? End quote. Yes, this bishop is being punished by having an apostolic administrator being named to run the diocese, while the bishop is reduced to a figurehead who runs the diocese and given the opportunity to spiritually reflect on things, which is a nice way of saying that he's going to be given the opportunity to really reflect on and absorb synodality. This story's not quite done yet, though. We get this story from ACI Africa, an African Catholic news outlet, with this headline: Retired Ivorian Cardinal appointed Ivory Coast Man Apostolic Administrator amid fallout, quote, internal wounds and tensions. His job, this bishop's job, is going to be to restore order, which will probably mean sweeping away this problem entirely. Not taking care of it, except maybe in the most egregious cases, where priests who have broken their vows are out in the open flaunting what they're doing. But overall, just make the mess go away. That is Francis's style, after all. The number of priests accused of McCarrick's stuff and bishops accused of the same, that he has given jobs in Rome, kind of attests to that. See how this is being handled? Africa is not saving the church, people. They've got problems of their own. I'm not saying that many of their bishops are finer bishops than ours in a lot of ways, but they're not saving the church. Christ will save his church. And if you want to cooperate with the grace that Christ needs to pour out to and will pour out onto the church to save the actual church itself from those within it, then please start thinking about Lent and how you can essentially pray for the graces and the sacrifices and the fastings that you'll need to do to help make that happen. The way we save the church is by becoming better Catholics ourselves. Taking on the old habits that disappeared in this time of materialism and excess. I'm curious what you have to say about this in the comments. Are you surprised at all about this story? Is this, do you think, going to be a contender at the end of the year for one of the weirdest and most bizarre stories of 2025? Let me know in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media, that helps too. If you've ever thought about becoming a supporter of Return to Tradition, there are options in the description box below. You can hit that join button, Patreon, subscribe star, all that stuff. It helps keep these daily messages coming and is greatly appreciated. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.